The clock above Farsamy read 11:47 p.m. when Miles Harding first heard the voice. He almost didn't stop. He had parked his car 2 blocks away because he couldn't find anything closer, which, honestly, was already an indignity for someone who controlled a $410 billion insurance portfolio. His flight back to Calgary had landed 3 hours late. His driver had gone home. And now he was standing outside a 24-hour pharmacy in downtown Toronto, picking up melatonin of all things, because his assistant had packed his toiletry bag wrong and he hadn't slept properly in 4 days. He was not in a charitable mood. The voice came from somewhere low to the ground near the entrance, small, careful, like whoever it belonged to had practiced the question many times before deciding to ask it. "Excuse me, sir. Do you know how insurance works?" Miles stopped. He turned around slowly, the way you do when you're not entirely sure what you just heard. There was a little girl sitting on the concrete step outside the pharmacy doors. Maybe 6 years old, maybe 7. She was wearing a puffy orange jacket that was slightly too big for her, the sleeves rolled up twice so her hands could poke out. She had a small backpack on her lap that she was hugging like a stuffed animal. Her hair was in 2 braids that had mostly come undone. She was looking at him with complete seriousness. "Sorry?" Miles said. "Insurance," she said again very clearly, as if perhaps he hadn't heard. "Do you know how it works? Because my grandma's been in there for a long time." She pointed at the pharmacy doors. "And the lady at the counter keeps saying something about insurance. And Grandma is crying a little bit. She doesn't want me to see, but I can see." Miles looked at the door, then back at the girl. "Where's your mom?" he asked. "At the hospital," she said simply. "That's why we're here. Grandma is getting medicine for her." He stood there on the sidewalk with his laptop bag over one shoulder and his coat half unbuttoned in the November cold, and something in his chest shifted in a way he didn't particularly want to examine. "What's your name?" he asked. "Penny," she said. "Penny," he repeated. "I'm Miles. How long has your grandma been inside?" She looked at the backpack in her lap. "Since before the clock said 11. The clock said 11 when we got here." "Almost an hour." Miles Harding had spent 22 years in the insurance industry. He had started as an actuary, moved into underwriting, built his way up through 3 different companies and 2 hostile acquisitions before landing the CEO role at Meridian Health Group 6 years ago. He understood the business with a clarity that most people in his position had stopped pretending to care about. He knew what the system looked like from the inside. He just usually made sure he didn't have to look at it from the outside. "Okay," he said, surprising himself. "Let's go see what's happening." Penny stood up immediately, like she'd been waiting for exactly that answer. The woman at the pharmacy counter was named Beverly, according to her name tag. She was in her late 60s, with reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, and she had the particular expression of someone who had been explaining the same thing for a very long time and was exhausted by the effort. The grandmother was standing across the counter from her. She was small, slight, wearing a dark wool coat with a brooch on the lapel, a little silver bird. Her name, Miles would later learn, was Dorothy Fenn. She had her wallet out. She was looking at the prescription bag on the counter the way you look at something you know you can't afford, but can't afford to leave without. The pharmacist, a younger man, mid-30s, tired eyes, was hovering near the back. He had the look of someone who wanted to help but had run out of ways to do it within the rules he'd been given. "Miss Fenn," Beverly was saying patiently, but with that particular Toronto pharmacy counter patience that has an edge under it, "your plan covers 60% of this. The remaining balance is $412. If you want, we can split the prescription. We can fill half of it tonight, which would bring the out-of-pocket to." "I understand that," Dorothy said. Her voice was very quiet, steady, but just barely. I don't understand why it changed. Last month it was covered. She was on this same medication last month and it was covered. Your plan renewed on November 1st. The formulary changed." "The formulary," Dorothy repeated. "The list of medications your plan covers. It gets updated every year." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Miles watched her hand, the one holding the wallet, tighten slightly. "She needs this medication," Dorothy said. "My daughter. She's in the hospital right now. They said she can come home Friday if she has this at home to continue the treatment. If she doesn't have it at home, she stays in the hospital. She has 2 children. A pause. "I have $412, but I was also going to use it for, it's November, the heat bill." Beverly's expression did not change. She had heard versions of this before. That was clear. The tragedy of her job was that she had heard versions of this before. "I'm sorry," Beverly said, and she meant it. Miles could tell. That was almost worse somehow. "I can call the plan directly, but at this hour they won't. The prior authorization line doesn't open until 8 a.m., Miles said. Both women looked at him. He hadn't meant to speak, but he knew the answer, so he said it. "The prior authorization line at most plans opens at 8 a.m., he said. "And then there's an average wait of 40 minutes. And then they'll need the prescribing physician to submit a clinical justification form, which takes another 2 to 5 business days, depending on the plan's processing queue." Dorothy Fenn looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her expression he couldn't quite read. "Who are you?" she asked. He almost said his name. Just his name, the way he'd said it to Penny outside. "I'm Miles. Hi." That ordinary, easy social reflex. What came out was, "I work in health insurance." The silence that followed was approximately 2 seconds long. It felt longer. "You work in health insurance," Dorothy said. "Yes." She studied him. Then she said very carefully, as if choosing each word like she was picking something up off a surface she wasn't sure would hold. "Then maybe you can explain to me why my daughter's medication, which she was taking last month, which her doctor prescribed, which was working, is suddenly not covered anymore, not because her condition changed, not because her changed their mind, but because November started." Miles opened his mouth, closed it, because he knew the answer to that too. He knew exactly why. Formulary management, drug tier renegotiations, cost containment strategy. He had signed off on a version of this process. Not this exact plan, not this exact drug, but the framework that produced this outcome in a boardroom meeting 9 months ago. There had been a slide deck. There had been projected savings figures. There had been a lunch afterward. He was aware of Penny standing slightly behind him, still holding her backpack. "Grandma," Penny said quietly, "this is Miles. He said he'd come help." Dorothy looked at her granddaughter. Something in her face went soft in a way that made Miles have to look away for a second. "That was very kind of him," Dorothy said in that voice adults use when they're trying to be honest without being unkind. Miles put his laptop bag down on the floor. "Can I see the prescription?" he asked. Beverly hesitated. There were privacy considerations. There were rules. But Dorothy nodded, and Beverly passed the paper bag across the counter. Miles looked at the medication name. He knew it. Of course he knew it. It was on the Tier 3 non-preferred list of half the plans on the market right now, because the original manufacturer's patent had expired, and the generic wasn't quite close enough in bioavailability to be automatically substituted, and the whole thing was a mess that the people who made these decisions understood only in the aggregate. In the aggregate, the number worked out. He handed the bag back. "There's a patient assistance program," he said. "The manufacturer runs it. It's income-based, but the threshold is reasonably high. You can apply online. There's a form. It usually takes a few days, but there's also an emergency provision for patients currently hospitalized. I've seen it approved in 24 hours under those circumstances." Beverly blinked. "I wasn't aware of. Most frontline pharmacy staff aren't. It's not well publicized. The manufacturers aren't incentivized to advertise it broadly." He paused. "The plan also, if your daughter is still actively hospitalized, her hospital social worker can submit a coverage exception request on her behalf. It's different from the standard prior auth. It has a faster processing track. I don't know which plan she's on specifically, but most plans have it." Dorothy was watching him very carefully now. "You know a lot about this," she said. "I do, and you work in health insurance." "I'm the CEO of Meridian Health Group," he said. He didn't say it with pride. He just said it. "I'm based in Calgary. I'm only here tonight because my flight was delayed." The silence is sometimes longer than 2 seconds. Dorothy Fenn looked at him for a long moment. She didn't look angry, which surprised him. She looked tired, which was worse. "My daughter's name is Allison," Dorothy said. "She's 34. She has 2 kids, Penny and a little boy, Marcus, who's 3. She was diagnosed in July. She went back to work in September because she had no choice. She has no partner, and her benefits through work are the only coverage she has. She came home from work on Tuesday feeling very sick. She thought it was just exhaustion. It wasn't." She stopped. Miles didn't say anything. "She's stable," Dorothy said. "They think she can be home by Friday. But she needs this medication at home, and I have been standing at this counter for 50 minutes, and I am very tired. And my granddaughter has been sitting outside in the cold because I didn't want her to hear any of this." Penny, apparently, had heard all of it anyway. She had her arms around Dorothy now. her face pressed into the side of her grandmother's wool coat, not making a sound. Miles looked at them. Then he looked at the prescription bag on the counter. He reached into his coat pocket and took out his phone. There was a number he had, a direct number, not a public line, a number for the executive liaison team that existed partly for regulatory reasons, and partly because even insurance companies sometimes needed to make things right quickly and quietly when the right circumstances aligned. He had never used it for anything like this. It was not what it was for. He dialed it anyway. It rang 4 times. Then a voice. A real human voice, not an automated system. Because this was an internal line, said, "Executive Liaison, this is Trevor Trevor." Miles said, "This is Miles Harding. I need a favor." He stood to the side of the counter while he was on the phone, speaking quietly, quickly. He could hear Beverly and Dorothy talking in low voices behind him. After a few minutes, he heard Penny ask the pharmacist if he could see the big rotating pill counter thing up close, and the pharmacist, laughing a little, said sure. The call took 11 minutes. When he hung up, he walked back to the counter. "Meridian doesn't hold this plan," he said, "but I have a colleague who does. She's going to make a call in the morning. First thing, before the lines open, to expedite the prior authorization. She's also going to flag the hospitalization exception. Your daughter should have coverage confirmation by 9:30, 10 a.m. Dorothy stared at him. "Tonight," he continued, "I'd like to cover the out-of-pocket if you'll let me. $412, not as charity, as an error correction. The formulary change should have come with patient notification. In most provinces, there are notification requirements. That's worth looking into." "I don't," Dorothy started. "It will take me about 30 seconds, he said. He pulled out his wallet. "Please." There was something on her face he couldn't look at directly. He looked at the counter instead, at the prescription bag, at the small silver bird on her lapel. After a moment, Dorothy said quietly, "All right." He handed his card to Beverly. The transaction processed. Beverly put the prescription bag in a paper pharmacy bag and passed it across the counter, and that was that. 11 minutes on the phone, 30 seconds of payment, and Allison Fenn's medication was going home tonight. He didn't know why that felt like so little and so much at the same time. They walked out together, Miles, Dorothy, and Penny. The night air hit them, cold and clean. The street was mostly quiet now, a few cabs moving through, the pharmacy's fluorescent glow spilling out behind them onto the sidewalk. Penny reached up and took her grandmother's hand. Dorothy's grip on the paper bag tightened, then loosened. "Thank you," Dorothy said. She said it simply, without ornament, and Miles understood it was not a social phrase. She meant it the way you mean something when you've been holding your breath for a long time and you've finally been allowed to exhale. "I'm sorry it works the way it works," he said, which was also not a social phrase. Dorothy looked at him. "Are you?" It wasn't cruel the way she said it. It was just honest. "I think about it," he said carefully. "I think about it more than people in my position are supposed to admit. That's something," she said. Then after a pause, "It's not enough, but it's something." He didn't argue with that. It would have been dishonest to argue with that. A cab turned the corner. Dorothy raised her free hand and it slowed. "Tell your daughter I hope she feels better," Miles said. "I will." Penny turned back before getting into the cab. She looked at him very seriously, the way she'd looked at him on the step outside the pharmacy, that quality of attention children have that adults mostly lose. "Miles," she said, "are you going to change how insurance works?" Dorothy made a soft sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite the opposite one. Miles crouched down so he was at eye level with Penny. The sidewalk was cold under his knee. He thought about what to say. He thought about the boardroom, the slide deck, the lunch afterward, the projected savings figures in a spreadsheet that had made perfect sense until 40 minutes ago when he was standing at a pharmacy counter at midnight, watching a 60-something woman in a silver bird brooch make the calculation between her daughter's medication and her heat bill. "I'm going to try," he said. "I'm going to try harder than I have been." Penny appeared to consider this. "Okay," she said, apparently satisfied. She got in the cab. Dorothy got in after her. The door closed. Miles stood on the sidewalk and watched the cab until it turned the corner and disappeared. He didn't get the melatonin. He forgot entirely, standing outside the pharmacy after they'd gone, and by the time he remembered he was already walking back toward his car, and he didn't feel like turning around. He didn't sleep that night anyway. He sat in his hotel room with his laptop open, and instead of the quarterly report he'd planned to review, He pulled up the formulary change documentation from the November renewal cycle, not Meridian's, because they didn't hold Allison Fenn's plan, but their own list, the medications that had moved tiers, the ones where the coverage had quietly thinned. There were 47 of them. He sat with that number for a while. Then he opened a new document and started writing. Not a memo, not a policy brief, something more like a letter to himself. About 47 medications. About a woman in a silver bird brooch doing math she shouldn't have to do. About what it meant to understand a system completely and then agree to run it anyway. He wrote until 4 in the morning. On the flight back to Calgary the next day, he called his VP of Plan Design. He asked her to put together a review. Not an audit, not a cost-benefit analysis, a genuine, human review of the formulary change notifications that had gone out to members in the last renewal cycle. Whether people had actually received them. Whether they'd understood them. Whether a 68-year-old woman standing at a pharmacy counter at midnight should have known in advance that November was going to be different from October. His VP was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. That's going to create some internal friction, she said carefully. I know, he said. The board is going to want a rationale. The rationale is that we're a health company, he said. The rationale is that health is in the name. Another pause. All right, she said. I'll put it together. He hung up and looked out the airplane window at the flat white of the prairies below, the way they stretched out to the horizon like a clean piece of paper. He thought about Penny's question. Are you going to change how insurance works? He didn't know. The honest answer was that one person, even the right person in the right position, could not change an entire system by having a bad night at a pharmacy. He knew that. He'd worked in systems long enough to understand how slow and resistant to change they were, how many competing interests held them in place, how many ways there were to do the right thing on a small scale and still be part of something that ground people down. But he also thought about what Dorothy had said. That's something. It's not enough. But it's something. He had spent 22 years getting very good at making decisions that looked right in a spreadsheet. Maybe it was time to get better at making decisions that looked right at midnight. He opened his laptop and started working on the letter again. The real one this time, the one he was eventually going to have to send somewhere. Maybe to his board. Maybe to the industry association. Maybe somewhere further than that. He didn't know yet. He just knew he had to write it. Outside the airplane window, the prairies gave way to the foothills and then the Rockies, jagged and certain, cutting the sky into something you couldn't ignore even if you tried. Miles Harding typed and looked out the window and typed some more. He thought about a little girl in an orange jacket, sitting on a concrete step in the November cold, asking a stranger if he knew how insurance worked. He thought about how he'd said yes without thinking. He thought about how, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't entirely sure that was true.